So, hello and welcome to this podcast, which is part of a series of podcasts for the Politics of Nuclear Non-Proliferation class at Charles University. I'm going to be your host today, Ronan Wordsworth, and today in my podcast we're going to be talking about AUKUS, the defence partnership between Australia, UK and the US, and its implications for the future of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. Now, the first half of the podcast is just going to be me introducing the topic, giving you some background information on the agreement and why it's important, and talking about specifically about the nuclear-powered submarines that are going to be part of the agreement and how that affects the non-proliferation regime. And then the second half is actually going to be having a really good discussion, hopefully, with my guest today, who is Sébastien Philippe. He is a writer for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, as well as being an associate research scholar at the University of Princeton within the School of Public and International Affairs and the program on Science and Global Security. So it's a very, very big honor to have him join me today to discuss this after I've gone through the initial background. So let's start from the beginning and what actually AUKUS is. Now, AUKUS is a defence partnership or agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, which is predominantly about providing security within the Indo-Pacific region, and this could be seen as maybe a bit of a pushback against rising Chinese expansionism in the region, and maybe an aim for the United States to secure their long-term partnership with Australia as a defence partner in the region. Now, as part of this AUKUS agreement, and why it's interesting to me today and why I'll be talking about it today in relation to the non-proliferation regime, is the provision of 12 nuclear-powered submarines. Now, what's interesting is Australia had previously signed an agreement with France to take 12 diesel-powered submarines, traditional diesel-powered submarines for the Navy. However, that contract has been cancelled in favour of receiving these nuclear-powered submarines from the United States as part of the AUKUS agreement. So now I'll go through exactly what I'm talking about when I say a nuclear submarine, because I think that's very important to the overall understanding of the issue. So, nuclear submarines, they're not actually necessarily equipped, and these certainly, there's no question that they won't be, that they would ever be armed with nuclear weapons. What they are, in fact, is going to be submarines armed with conventional weapons. However, they are powered, and all the onboard energy is provided by nuclear energy. Now, this technology has been around for a long time for the United States and for Russia. However, it's a very closely guarded secret, as any navy would love to have their hands on some nuclear-powered submarines or nuclear submarines, because of their benefits in naval operations. Now, nuclear submarines, as opposed to normal submarines, can operate for months at a time, and they're really only governed by the amount of supplies that they can have on board. So they've got a huge advantage over regular submarines, as well as being much quieter to operate. So as you can understand, these are very, very important technology, and it's interesting that this is actually the first time that this technology is going to be, if it goes ahead, is going to be given to a non-nuclear weapon state by a nuclear weapon state, if we exclude India, because they're a bit of a grey area, as I'll go through later. So this is actually the first time, or only the second time really, that the United States have ever shared any of their nuclear submarine technology. The first was with the UK in the 1960s, who already were a nuclear power. So this is the first time sharing it with a non-nuclear power. And that is really significant, because it shows a huge shift away from the 1980s view from America, where they actually blocked Canada from receiving nuclear-powered submarines from the UK because of its implications for the non-proliferation regime. That's what they claimed. So what countries actually have these nuclear submarines? Well, there's really two types. There's the highly enriched uranium variations, which is the ones operating on weapons-grade uranium, which is uranium that has really over 93% uranium-235, which is the radioactive version. And the countries that have these are the United Kingdom, Russia, and the United States. And then there's the lower enriched uranium versions, which is typically less than 20%, similar to a civilian nuclear reactor. And France and China both operate on these lower enriched uranium variations. So now I've gone through a bit about what the nuclear submarines are about. Now I'll talk about the other important aspect, which is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now the NPT. So the NPT was first introduced in 1968 and is actually one of the most widely adopted treaties in the history of the UN. What it does is it sets out really two different types of states, being the nuclear weapon states, the states that had nuclear weapons at the time, which is France, the United Kingdom, United States, Russia, and China, and then the rest of the world as non-nuclear weapon states. So the non-nuclear weapon states, as part of this, agree not to try and obtain nuclear weapons. Now, the only countries that are not signatory to the NPT is 4 other nuclear countries, nuclear weapons holding countries, we'll say, which is India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, who withdrew from the NPT when they were pursuing their own enrichment program and were subsequently shunned and pushed away by the international community because of this, as well as South Sudan, who haven't signed it just because they are basically the newest country in the world, and they've just not signed on to the NPT as of yet, but there's no particular reason there. So what the NPT actually sets out is basically 3 pillars. The first pillar is the important pillar for the non-nuclear weapon states, which is the non-proliferation, which is saying they will not look to pursue any or actually actively get any nuclear weapons. Now, that has been immensely successful. As I said, the only country that signed on and has since withdrawn and has obtained nuclear weapons is North Korea, and they've been ostracized by the international community for doing such. And so as you see that from the 1960s to now, many countries have the technology to be able to develop nuclear weapons, but no country has actually done it. The second pillar is about disarmament. So this applies to the 5 nuclear weapon states, as I set out earlier, and those countries agree to work towards disarming their nuclear weapons stockpiles towards 0. Now, this is ambiguous about the duration. There's no set guidelines on how many weapons must be destroyed per year, say, or by when. So this pillar may be seen by some to be neglected by the nuclear weapon states as part of their responsibilities. And then the third and final pillar is on the civilian use of nuclear technology. So as you can imagine, there's very good reasons for using nuclear power as an energy generation source, and especially in this day and age with the concerns about climate change, nuclear technology provides a great option for future development and reducing carbon emissions. So the next important thing that I would like to introduce before having my guest Sebastian come and talk is about the Safeguards Agreement. Now, there's a Safeguards Agreement became as an addendum to the NPT. And the Safeguards Agreement is actually between the non-nuclear weapon states and the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association. Now, their job is basically to act like policemen. The Safeguards Agreement is their rule book, and it sets out how they can verify and inspect the non-nuclear weapon states to basically ensure that they are not pursuing any enrichment processes for obtaining nuclear weapons. And the IAEA inspectors are allowed and are active in all countries that are signatory to the NPT that are non-nuclear weapon states, and it's been very successful for since its inception, basically. And what's interesting and what's relevant to this discussion today around the Safeguards Agreement is one particular article, which is Article 14, which has been considered previously by many experts to be somewhat of a loophole, maybe a backdoor by which a non-nuclear weapon state could pursue the objective of obtaining a nuclear weapon outside the guides and the visibility and verification measures of the IAEA. Now, this Article 14 is talking about the non-peaceful, non-explosive usage of nuclear material, which would be, for instance, powering a nuclear submarine, where it's used in a military application but as a non-weapon. And what Article 14 basically sets out is that this nuclear material can exist outside verification measures, and because of the secrecy involved with the technology to power the submarines, for instance, and it is against this background that we come to the AUKUS agreement. Now, this loophole, or Article 14, has never actually been used before by any non-nuclear weapon state to have a highly enriched uranium stockpile. However, were Australia to go through and over the next couple of decades obtain these nuclear-powered submarines, they would have to utilize this Article 14 to have a highly enriched uranium stockpile to supply the fuel for the submarines. Now, this is significant because, as I said, this is the first time that this has been used by a country outside of the nuclear weapon states. And what it in effect means is that there can be huge amounts of nuclear material. If we're talking about 500 kilograms of highly enriched uranium per core of a submarine, for 12 submarines, that's already, we're at 6 tons of material, where in effect this material is outside the eyes of inspectors and verifying for up to like 3-4 decades while the submarine's in its service life, basically. Now, if a country was to start an enrichment program, the agreed upon amount for a nuclear weapon is only 25 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. So you can see very quickly, if you take out half a ton, we're talking about the possibility to build 20 nuclear weapons. This obviously would have huge implications for the current stability in the nuclear regime and would actually be a huge example of proliferation. Previously, Brazil has actively pursued a nuclear submarine program, and then that was subsequently cancelled due to costs from 2014. Iran stated that they would like to pursue a nuclear submarine development program as well. And so you can see this is actually basically opening the door, or opening Pandora's box, to see how this loophole could be used in the future, and again how that could potentially impact on the countries that have nuclear weapons and the potential for some sort of proliferation. So in saying all that, now I've gone through a lot of the background, and I think now is a great time to introduce my special guest onto today's podcast. So as I said before, he's a predominant expert in the field of security and nuclear weapons, and it's with my great pleasure I'd like to introduce Sébastien Philippe to talk about AUKUS and its implications for the NPT. So thank you. So Sébastien, my first question to you is about your article that you wrote for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And in the article you argue that Australia being provided with nuclear submarines by the USA creates a dangerous precedent for the future. Given this, what countries would you anticipate, or could you anticipate, would use this precedent, and in what possible ways?
Well, first, thank you for having me, Ronan, today. And so let me give you a little bit of background here before I answer your first question. I started working on this issue, it was 7 years ago, when it became apparent that Brazil, which is also, just like Australia, a non-nuclear weapon states, was moving forward with building, launching a nuclear submarine program, but also building a first prototype naval reactor. And this was the first time, really, that the non-nuclear weapon state was going to use nuclear materials for a military application. So, as you probably know, it is the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency to verify in all non-nuclear weapon states that are party to the treaty that all materials in those countries is used for peaceful purposes, and that it's all accounted for also. Now, the issue we have here, obviously, is that the IAEA, under the safeguards agreement that it has with non-nuclear weapon states, is not allowed to access military classified information. And the safeguard agreements also provide an opportunity for non-nuclear weapon states to remove materials from safeguards for use in non-proscribed military activities. So here, the nuclear propulsion of nuclear submarines, attack submarines, for example.
Yeah.
So this issue has been around for decades, really. That fear that there was this loophole that could be used, and so the first country that really started asking a question around those lines was Canada in the 80s. Then Canada eventually decided not to go forward under massive pressure from the United States. And then came Brazil. No, Brazil was making very slow progress in the past few years, and so the U.S. and U.K. decision to provide assistance to Australia of a nuclear submarine came kind of really as a surprise here. And so my argument of why this was such an issue was because this is a massive reversal in U.S. policy. So the U.S. always has tried to limit the spread of this technology, to put extreme pressure internationally to prevent other countries from acquiring this technology. And one of the rationale was to prevent or open new path for nuclear proliferation. So essentially here, using this possibility to remove nuclear materials from international control for military use as a diversion pathway towards developing nuclear weapons. And which, so, sorry?
Yeah, which I think you have mentioned before is like it's a significant amount of material compared to what is required for a nuclear weapon as well. I think it's about 50 to 100 times the amount of material or something that's removed from the safeguards.
Yes, absolutely. So in the case of the AUKUS agreement, the technology that is used by the US and UK is naval reactors that are fueled with weapon-grade uranium, so uranium enriched to over 93% in the uranium-235 isotope.
Yep.
And that's really weapon grade. I mean, you can use this and weaponize this directly. And we're talking roughly about half a ton, 500 kilograms per submarine core. And, you need probably well, one quantity that is internationally accepted is 25 kilograms of HEU. It's probably enough to do a bomb. So
yep,
it's really large amount of HEU we're talking about. And so other countries that have, since the AUKUS announcement, we knew others had been interested in the past. Iran had expressed interest. South Korea has expressed interest. Some in Japan have expressed interest. The Indian Navy has been developing nuclear submarines with the help of Russia, but has re-expressed interest also to obtain the same technology. So there's two competing, I would say, military trends that are concerning. One is the spread of that technology, because it's such an asset to all the countries in the Indo-Pacific, essentially. And the second is whether that can also be used for
proliferation purposes.
For proliferation purposes, and either developing the bomb or justifying the development of new nuclear program, so that state become threshold states. They don't necessarily develop the bomb, but they also develop their indigenous capability to enrich uranium, for example, and so on. So that's a big issue also.
And well, another follow-up question to that would then be, do you think that the reaction internationally, because I haven't seen a whole lot of international media attention given to it, would have been very different if it was, say, Iran actively pursuing building nuclear submarines? I mean, obviously, as you said, they've been interested in the past, but the reaction from the international community might have been quite different.
Yeah. I mean, it would be a major pushback, but there was pushback on the AUKUS deal. There was concern in the US from the non-proliferation community also that this was not a great idea, especially because the deal involved such large quantities of possibly weapon-grade uranium, and that the US has, since 9/11, has spent $1 billion or something trying to get rid of highly enriched uranium everywhere in the world, converting reactors that were running on HEU to LEU and so on. And so by just making this deal, you're reversing 2 decades of effort of HEU minimization. So, all kinds of issues now, not everyone is happy, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, and you've already touched a lot on what my second question was going to be, which was about the US in particular. So basically, with such a big policy shift from their decision in the 1980s with Canada and preventing them getting nuclear submarines and using proliferation reasons as the main argument for that, could this potentially provide a pathway for the US to provide nuclear submarine technology with other countries, such as you mentioned, South Korea or Japan, allies of the United States in the future? Or do you think that Australia would be a one-off case, or could it actually spell like a larger push for as well Russia or China to share this technology with their allies as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and know that this, essentially the US has just set a new precedent that it was okay, not just to transfer the technology to existing nuclear weapon state, because the US has done this with the UK, Russia has done this with India, but for nuclear weapon state to transfer the technology to non-nuclear weapon state, it's a first. And yes, so you're opening up a new market. I'd like to say every admiral in every medium to large size navy around the world is going to want a nuclear submarine, and so yes, you're gonna see demand, and that demand could be filled with the US other administration. This one, the Biden administration, has said that they won't do it again. This was a one-off deal, but already South Korea has expressed extreme frustration. Now, it was also reported recently that South Korea is getting help from Russia to build a prototyped naval reactor run with LEU. It says that this is for civilian nuclear propulsion, but it can also obviously be used for nuclear submarine propulsion. So you can see that, yes, by opening the door and creating a new precedent, then there are new opportunities. The French also, really went kind of all their way to so in this original submarine deal that the French had with Australia, the French took their new nuclear attack submarines and converted it to a conventional version for the Australian market.
Diesel powered rather than
and they could have, if they could have sold nuclear submarine right away to Australia. The problem, the reason why they did not do that in the past was because the US was always adamant to prevent such transfers. So the door has been opened, so you can see definitely different countries may have interest to make such deals. I mean, those would be major strategic military exports, and so yes, why not?
Okay, thanks very much. All right, so the next question I had was, given all this, I mean, we are aware of, I think it's Article 14 in the Safeguards Agreement, and should the IAEA look to potentially close this loophole in the future to allow safeguarding and the verification of the full nuclear fuel cycle of this highly enriched uranium, even above and beyond the protections allowed for, as you said, of protecting the highly sensitive reactor technology, and could it be done while still protecting this technology?
So I 2014, I published an article that was
I've read that.
targeted at Brazil, and I kind of highlighted possible ways for the IAEA to safeguard the naval fuel cycle in the context of Brazil. The bottom line is, like, it's very dependent on the type of reactor and the technology, whether there's access for refueling the reactor, whether the reactor needs refueling or not, and so on. Who provides the fuel, but you could imagine ways for the IAEA to implement some degrees of safeguards. No, the problem, of course, is, do states want the IAEA to do that? And there are limitations. Obvious, if the IAEA is not to learn any classified information, then there are things you can't do. Really, I mean, there are measurements you cannot conduct that the IAEA would do normally. And the other issue is that submarines, are fueled for periods of 10 to 20, 30 years, and you may not have access to the reactor for so long. So
you're talking about a 30-year window, basically, where this fuel could be outside of verification, because I guess one of your proposals, I think, was to check the fuel as it was coming out of use and being decommissioned, basically, and as it was going into use. But it's still got a very large window, I guess, where...
Yeah, and I mean, there are ways to possibly, kind of have special seals, even passive seals that you put towards the reactor that would record neutrons emitted from the reactor, just to make sure that they've been operating, and they've been operating for so many hours and so on, or so many days. So there are ways you can go around, but it's very unclear whether inspectors would have the right to do so.
Would be allowed to do so by the...
Right. With who you gonna negotiate? I mean, all of this is new and unprecedented, and so
Which actually, I think that leads quite nicely onto my next question. So basically, the other authors have suggested that Australia could use this as a potential opportunity to lead by example on how a non-nuclear weapon state could safely be using highly enriched uranium and still adhering to the guidelines of the NPT and their obligations, and working under the IAEA standards. So you, as you said, you've also written previously about the potential safeguards the IAEA could implement to try and make the process safer. So my question then is, do you think that some sort of negotiation could happen with Australia and the IAEA to bring an agreement about how the first non-nuclear weapons state can create a universally acceptable standard? What would this look like? And yeah, could Australia be used as a potentially positive test case?
You know, I don't think so, because I mean, first of all, and that's my opinion, I think it's a terrible idea from the get-go for different reasons. Second, no, it can't be a precedent, because the arrangements are going to be very specific to the arrangements that will, and the technology and the fuel that will be provided by the US and the UK and so on. You know, you can't really provide a universal example, you know, for everyone. And second, I mean, as long as you use HEU, I think that's a terrible idea from the get-go.
Yep.
I think that's, you know, really going back on decades of effort of trying to minimize the use and getting rid of this material that is weapon usable. And I think that's, for me, one of the biggest mistake here that is being done. So if, you know, Australia really wants to mitigate this, one, it should not run the reactor on HEU. And so, you know, make arrangements with the US and the UK or other countries to provide LEU and to design or redesign the reactor to be fuel with LEU. So that would alleviate, you know, most of the concerns here. And then, yes, have some degree of safeguards with the IAEA, if this is where we're going, essentially.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think you would want to set precedents on that it's totally fine to use HEU for military purpose and remove such materials out, you know, completely out of safeguards anywhere in the world. You know, thinking that you would be able to set such precedent is also, you know, I mean, it's just not, it's never going to work. I mean, if you run,
yeah,
say so, you know, oh yes, we're going to follow, we are going to follow Australia example. We will run with HEU and it will be safeguarded. So we're going to start to produce massive amount of HEU, and that's totally, you know, going to be okay. No one is going to accept that. So it is a big issue here.
Yeah, I find it very interesting. I think if Iran was the first country to do this, then, as you say, nobody would be acceptable. Nobody would find that acceptable, I think. So it really...
Yeah. I mean, you know, we're trying to prevent Iran from having enough materials to build one bomb.
Mm.
And here we're talking about, you know,
20 or 50 or 100.
Yeah. So actually the amount of materials that you would need for a proper nuclear weapon program, right? Because, I mean, building one nuclear weapon is not going to make you essentially not going to make you a nuclear weapon states with mature and credible deterrent. But 20, 50, 100 weapons, you know, it might start becoming more serious. And so you definitely don't want to encourage a state to produce materials, weapon-grade materials, in such quantities for any purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So
I agree. So, all right. In saying all this, I think you also wrote in your 2014 article about the risk of the theft of highly enriched naval fuel. And actually, that's the most high risk of theft of any of the situations, because it's outside the safeguards and for various other reasons. France and China have moved to low-level uranium-enriched material for powering the nuclear subs. With this deal, it would seem as though the US is committed to using highly enriched uranium for the foreseeable future, unless there's drastic design changes, as you've said, from the original nuclear-powered submarines that they have. So what advice then would you give to policymakers in the US with regard to this, and how it affects their commitments and obligations for denuclearization under the NPT? And I mean, especially given that it's now a democratic government, and I think we would probably expect them, or traditionally they've been much more committed to denuclearization and the NPT.
So what advice would I give to U.S. policymakers? Well, first of all, in the U.S., between the U.S. and Australia, there are other agreements, bilateral agreements, that are in force, and right now they do prevent the transfer of nuclear materials for military purposes or naval propulsion. So for the deal to move forward, for this to actually materialize, really, you're going to have to amend existing agreements between the US and Australia. This will require Congress approval. So my recommendation right now is for Congress to be wary of a one-off exemption, that whatever it does will set new standards for other countries, and that in agreeing to the deal, Congress should ask for specific non-proliferation commitments from the administration. And one of them could be to push the administration to develop a dedicated LEU reactor for this deal, because the development of LEU fuel reactors in the U.S. Have been proposed, for also a few decades, and recently, under the Obama administration, there was some interest, or beginning of interest, at least to try new fuel, or try modeling, try testing new types of fuel that could support life of ship reactors with LEU and so on. So there is some money for R&D, and so I think this should be done. This is, if this is really where things are going, then you have an opportunity to do so. So Congress should ask this. Should also ask for a complete review of the non-proliferation implications of the deal, because this has not been done. You could see that the way the deal was made inside the White House, it was mostly involving people who deal with the Indo-Pacific region, but not folks that are nuclear and non-proliferation experts. And so this needs to be done also seriously. And and as part of those non-proliferation commitments, it will be to think and design safeguards to protect the fuel from diversion, of course, but also from a nuclear security point of view. As you say, there's the threat of theft and so on. So there is a lot to be done. But to me, essentially, the interesting thing is that politically, this is still a paper submarine. I mean, it has nothing has been, kind of set in stone in terms of design and deals and how much this is going to cost and so on. And we know that there are internal studies that are going on right now.
And Australia, I think, is currently coming up to a federal election as well, which
could have an impact on this.
Could have an impact as well. So at the moment, it's hypothetical, but I think it's
right. But my bottom line is, I think, the U.S. Congress and the U.S. administration should think much more carefully about the non-proliferation implications here.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and then finally, I think my last question, so is about Article 14, and because it could potentially, I guess, be used for other military applications in the future for non-nuclear weapon states to say non-weapon, non-peaceful use, I believe is the phrase. How could the IAEA be closing this loophole? Is there a push to close this loophole? I know we just missed the latest NPT review, which was supposed to be happening at the moment, I believe. But I don't know if this would have been on the agenda, but I think it's been brought to the fore, I guess, by this agreement.
Right. So the NPT RevCon was pushed back because of COVID again, and we don't know when it will take place. We know that China had actually put out a paper criticizing the loophole and the fact that this was setting a bad precedent and so on. So, you know, an obvious political reaction from China to take this on. No, the problem with the NPT is you have so many countries that are involved that trying to amend anything or agree on anything is at this point near impossible. So to close the loophole, you would need to revise the comprehensive safeguard agreement, and that's going to be extremely long shot. You know, you would even have countries like Brazil, for example, who's building its own naval reactor program, will definitely be against this. And if you don't have consensus, you know, and agreement across the board, you cannot make any change. So it's
difficult.
Well, you know, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. On that optimistic note, is there any other remarks that you have for to close it out?
Look, I mean, this is we are. I mean, you know, we are entering, I think, a new period. You know, some call it the new Cold War and so on. You know, the rising tensions between the U.S. and China, and rising tension in the Indo-Pacific. And as you know, China has made moves to increase the size of its nuclear arsenals. The U.S. has tried to respond, and one part of the response was the AUKUS deal. But so has this, you know, possible new arms race that is now unfolding move forward? We're going to see more situations like this. You know, not necessarily nuclear submarines and so on, but you know, there will be
questions about the nuclear order that we have at the moment.
Right. You know, technology transfer, whether it's from the U.S. or other countries and so on. So we're going to see more and more of this, and yeah, we need all hands on deck to try to you know prevent things from running out of control. Yeah.
All right. I think that's pretty much everything I had for you today. So I'd just like to say thank you again very much for making the time and coming on. It's been a really good chat, and yes, yeah, I'll definitely let you know once I've.
Thank you for having me, and you know, I hope you get an A.
Thank you. No, I'll definitely send you the link once it's finalized, and you can have a look. But thanks again, Sebastian, and I'll chat to you later.
Yeah, you have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you. You too. Ciao.